Good morning. Today is the feast day of St. Louis the Ninth, King of France, who was the king in the 1200s and was a very pious man, totally devoted to God, dedicated his service of his kingship to God, and he was a man of deep prayer. In fact, they often called him the monk king, even though he wasn't a monk. They just, because he was such a prayerful man, such a holy man, they decided they would call him the monk king. And part of being holy and also being the one in power is making sure that people believe properly. And so there was this heresy going around in France called the Albigensian heresy, where the Albigensians believed in kind of a dual God, that there was a good God and an evil God, which really can't be, because God is one. God is just by himself. And also because evil isn't really a thing. Evil is a lack of a thing. Evil is a lack of good, right? It's a total void of good. When we think of history's most evil people, and we say that person is evil incarnate. That person is evil incarnate. There is no such thing, but rather that person is totally devoid of any goodness. At least so it would seem. There's the goodness of the fact that he was created in the image and likeness of God, so he can't be completely devoid of goodness, but at least in the way that we would see that he may be devoid of goodness. And so we recognize in St. Louis, the King of France, this saint, this patron who desired goodness for his people, who desired holiness for his people. And so he led a crusade against the Albigensians, and you might think, the Crusades, those are bad, right? Not in and of themselves. There were some abuses that took place during the Crusades, but that he went to root out this heresy of Albigensianism. And so he loved his people, who he governed. He loved them to the point that he wanted their salvation. That was the highest good, right? The highest good wasn't how much money they had. They didn't have any money because they were probably peasants. The highest good wasn't that they were happy. The highest good wasn't that their roads were paved. The highest good wasn't that everybody had 2 cars in their driveway. The highest good wasn't even that inflation was low. This was back in the day when the government cared about the salvation of people's souls, right? That was the king's highest good, because he saw himself as appointed by God to govern over people, and to govern over people means to love them, and to love people means to desire and will their good. So in the gospel, the scholar of the law comes and tests Jesus, and he says, "What's the greatest of the law?" And Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." First, love God, right? And then love your neighbor as yourself. We can't really truly love our neighbor unless we first love God. We can't love ourselves unless we first love God. And Jesus says the whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments. A lot of times we think of the law as oppressive. We think of the law as burdensome. We think of the law as things that we have to do. When in reality, we recognize that Jesus is saying, if you keep the law the way that I intend for it to be kept, you will love me, and that will enable you to love those around you. But if you try to manipulate it, if you try to make it serve you, you're not loving me, and you're incapable of loving those around you. But if you do my will, if you listen to me, if you follow me, if you look at everything that the prophets have foretold, then you will be able to do my will, which is love me and love your neighbor as yourself. And so the good King St. Louis, of course, loved first and foremost God. He loved God with all his heart, with all his mind, with all his strength, and he loved his neighbor as himself. You might say, well, how could he love his neighbor as himself if he went crusading against the Albigensians? Because they were not loving God, and they were certainly not loving themselves or their neighbors, because they had this, again, like I said, this dualistic idea where there's good and there's evil, and we have to fight against the evil world so that we can be set free. The world in and of itself is not evil because God created the world and said it is good. And so they had this false notion of kind of pushing against the world, trying to set ourselves free from the world, sort of a Gnostic understanding of good and evil. Whereas if we follow the law, if we follow the commandments, we can recognize the goodness in the world so that we may indeed love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so on this feast day of St. Louis the Ninth, King of France, let us ask for his intercession, that he may watch over us and that we may truly be able to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and that we may be able to love our neighbors as ourselves.